Welcome to part 3 of my Metal Tone in the Mix series. In this episode, we're going to be talking about your amp settings, and I'm going to help give you a starting point for getting a good metal tone that's going to sit well in the full mix. And remember, we're using a real amp for this. So just a quick recap here. In part 1, we went over all of the gear that you need to get a good metal tone in the full mix. Your amp, your hardware, software, all that good stuff. Then the video right before this, we talked about the best type of guitars, and that was a really interesting video, so definitely go back and watch that if you haven't seen it yet. Now I'm about to give you the amp settings that you can start with to get that good tone in a full mix. Now the most important thing about this video is to remember we're talking about a good metal tone for the full mix. Meaning in there with the drums, the bass guitar, other guitars, the vocals, everything that's going on. That tone is going to be a little bit different from the tone you're used to playing with in your bedroom or in your studio when you're just jamming by yourself. So we're going to jump right into this, guys. And I'm going to share with you the settings right now that I have on the amp that I'm using, which is the EVH5153. Now this is a 50 watt head with the EL34 tubes. So you can see the settings right here, and I'm going to go over each setting in a little bit more detail, and I'm going to tell you why it is where it is. And we're going to start out with, of course, the gain, because we have nothing to lose but everything to gain. Before we dig into these settings and talk about them, I want you to, of course, hear what they sound like first. So this is what the current settings sound like. I want you to hear this same tone in the full mix. Now, when you heard that single track, you may have thought, this is kind of missing a little bit of bottom end, and it just doesn't sound like it has that chunkiness. Now, you may have not been able to tell on YouTube here, watching it here, but I can certainly tell in the room, and if you were in the room with me hearing the amp, you'd probably say something to that effect. You'd be like, yeah, it's a cool tone, but it seems to be missing a little something. Now, when you heard it in the full mix, you probably caught those elements that maybe you missed in the single track. So first, let's talk about your gain setting. And this is kind of hard for a lot of metal guitar players to wrap their heads around, their metal heads. But this is probably the most crucial part of dialing in a good metal tone. Again, that sits well in the mix. That's what this is all about. And I don't mean to sound like a broken record, but that's the crucial part of this series. Dialing in that awesome tone that sits well in the full mix. The problem with cranking up the gain too high on any amp, now we're using a tube amp here of course, but I would say it's the same for a solid state amp as well. The problem if your gain is too high is it tends to produce a very muddy mix. That high gain may sound awesome when you're in your studio or in your room just jamming and playing or whatever, or even if you're at band practice or something like that, it may sound okay. However, when you record that guitar track and if it's got too much gain, with everything else that's going on, in layman's terms here, it's gonna clash a little bit with the other frequencies and everything going on, and it's just gonna make your overall mix sound muddy. That's not what you want. So the little trick here with gain, and this is kind of specific to tube amps, well, there's two tricks. Number one, the higher your volume is on your amp, the lower your gain should be. Because with tube amps, as you raise that volume, you're gonna get more natural gain and saturation. Maybe not so much distortion, but you can back that gain off as you raise the volume and get a really nice metal tone that sits really good in the mix and actually cuts through the mix when you want those notes to be pronounced if you're playing riffs. So remember that rule. The higher the volume, the less gain you need. Now, me personally, I typically record at probably lower volumes than most people record, and that has a lot to do with a specific type of amp. I know it sounds like I'm trying to sell you guys on the EVH 5153 amp, but it is a pretty awesome amp. Actually, I do have a link to all the gear that I use in the description of this video, so definitely make sure you check that out later. So I can still get a really nice metal tone even at a lower volume, which is still kind of loud here in my studio, but it's just not cranked up, you know, like you have to do with most amps to get a good metal tone. Trick number 2, and it's not really a trick, try playing with the lowest gain you possibly can while still getting that distortion and saturation that you want from your amp. And one of the best things to do is to go to the other side of the room and play and have a buddy or your studio engineer play around with that gain as you're playing. And just have your engineer or whoever is controlling your amp at that time, have them continuously back off the gain until you're not getting that sound that you like anymore. That's the best way to do it. What this is gonna do is gonna bring out the clarity in your notes. And this is important, especially if you're playing a lot of riffs. You want to be able to hear those notes. If your gain's cranked all the way up or cranked up too high, once that gets into the mix, you're not going to be able to distinguish those notes that you're playing. It's just going to sound like mud. Now, this doesn't mean that you have to turn your gain all the way down. That's not what I'm saying. You guys saw where my gain was. My sweet spot's anywhere between 6 and 7. So technically that's still kind of up there, but we just don't have it cranked up to like 8, 9, or 10 or something like outrageous. This is the second most crucial part of getting a good tone in the full mix when it comes to metal, and that's the bottom end. That's your bass setting. Here's the thing to remember about bass and your amp and the full mix. Your guitar is not the instrument to produce those low frequencies. Those low frequencies are saved for the bass guitar and the kick drum and some of the other lower frequencies that may come from the toms and maybe some other instruments. Maybe you have a keyboard player as well that might play some low notes from time to time. You need to make sure that your guitar tone is leaving room for those frequencies to come through. If your bass is too high on your amp, then your guitar is going to produce those frequencies, which they're going to compete with those frequencies of the instruments that those frequencies are supposed to come from. And I know I've probably just confused everybody. The rule is don't crank your bass up on your EQ on your amp. And what that means is your tone that you're playing with while you're recording your guitar, it might not sound like it's chunky enough, but just trust the process here. Trust that when the bass guitar is added in and when the drums is added in and everything else is added in, it's gonna sound awesome. And the thing is, you can always EQ a little bit more bottom end if you have to after the fact. And EQ, amongst a few other things that happened in the post-production process, that's something I'll actually talk about. I think it's in episode 5 of this series. The one thing that's gonna be difficult to do is if you have too much bass in your amp. That's kind of difficult to EQ out in the post-production process. So it's better to have to add some in post-production if needed, which I can almost promise you that will not need to happen. In fact, you'll probably still have to roll off the bottom end. And again, we'll get to that later. As far as you recording your amp, make sure you don't have too much bass. And you saw my setting earlier, I'll show it to you again. I've got mine set just below 5. In other words, I'm not boosting the bass on my amp. And that's just gonna give me a really nice tone that sits well in the mix, but also gives room for those other instruments like the bass guitar and the drums to produce those low end frequencies. Had to get some coffee after that. I hope you guys are enjoying this so far, by the way. So if so, please give this a like, leave me a comment. Also make sure you're subscribed. All right, so let's go over the other EQ settings, and I'm also gonna talk a little bit about pedals and that sort of thing. For these next 3 settings, the mids, the treble, and your presence, they're really personal preferences in my opinion. So let's start with the mids, because that comes after the bass. So me, I'm an old school metal tone player, so I like a little mid cuts. I will warn you, don't cut the mids too much. If you're like me and you like those mids cut a little bit, because it does give you just a different kind of like classic metal, thrash metal, chunky sound, don't cut them out all the way. That's just going to be really difficult to distinguish those notes when it gets into the final mix. Me, as a person that likes to cut the mids, I only cut mine down to about 4, sometimes just slightly less than that. So don't overdo it or don't underdo it. Now, some of you like to play with more mids, especially if you're into more of the modern metal, the gent. I think some of that style, calls for a little bit mid boost, a little bit of a mid boost in there. Or if you're playing like with lower notes, like an 8-string guitar or even a 7-string guitar, although I tend to cut my mids on my 7-string as well. But there are some styles and other subgenres of metal where you may want to boost the mids. What I would say to you there is don't boost them too much, because then you may be producing some weird frequencies that's kind of hard for the sound engineer or whoever is doing the mixing for your album or song. It's kind of difficult, makes their job more difficult to get those frequencies right, and you don't want to do that. Now we move on to the treble. What I would advise you with treble is probably don't make any treble cuts at all, because with metal, when you're playing any subgenre, any style of metal, there's a certain amount of highs that you want in your mix. Of course, it also depends on the amp. Different amps produce different sounds and frequencies and that sort of thing, so you kind of have to cater your EQ to your amp. Again, I'm just giving you a nice starting point to begin with, but I personally boost my treble to about 6.5, sometimes 7, just depending on the sound that I'm going for. Now we move over to the presence. And no, I'm not talking about Christmas presents. Presence is sort of like mids, it's a personal preference, and in my experience, whether I cut or boost the presence really depends on the amplifier I'm playing through. So for example, you can see the EVH here. I like to cut the presence. I usually cut my presence down almost to where I cut my mids. That gives me the tone that I like and that I want, and that it caters to my style of playing. Again, this is something you really have to play around with to see what fits your style. I know some guitarists like to boost the presence. Here's what you need to be careful with though. If you boost your presence, you probably don't want to boost your treble too high, because that's going to create some really high frequencies there, and that might cause some problems in the mix. So if you're boosting that presence knob, visit your treble. You might want to cut the treble back just a little bit. Now, speaking of EQ, we've got the volume knob on the amp, so we definitely want to address that. Now, with a tube amp, oftentimes you're going to crank up the volume pretty loud. I can't really tell you where to crank it to. I'll be honest with you, on my EVH, I think I said this earlier, I don't record at a super high volume. Now, it's loud in this room, but I've only got it up to like 1.5, sometimes 2. And again, that produces a very loud metal tone, but it's not like I've got it cranked up to like 7 or 8 or anything like that. I can still get a really good tone at that lower volume, which is not really that low, because again, it's pretty loud. Now, other amps where you do have to crank up the volume to get the gain that you want out of it. I think some of you who play through the Mesa Boogie dual rectifier, or maybe you've got like a PV6505, something like that. I know the Marshalls, you have to crank that volume up a little bit to get that saturated and distorted tone that you want. Don't forget the gain rules that we talked about earlier though. So you really just have to go by the amp you're using and just make sure you're getting a good tone. When it comes to this type of stuff, it's really good to have someone in the room with you that knows sound, that knows guitars, and knows your style of playing and kind of what you want to kind of help you out. That can really be helpful and go a long way if you have that luxury. We all need good metal friends. Now, one more thing before we move on to pedals, because I want to talk about that, because that's something else that can really impact your tone going into the full mix. Some amplifiers have what's called a resonance knob, and you'll find that on the back, like my EVH, for example. I've got that. Funny thing is, I didn't realize I had that knob until like I had the amp for 3 or 4 months, and I was wondering, I'm like, dude, this just isn't giving me the, the tone I want. He's like, oh, well, there's this resonance knob on the back. Have you messed with that? Nope. Messed with that, and holy crap, that gave me some really awesome tones. That's just another feature that some amps have. You have to be careful with that, because that resonance can give you more punch. However, that can also increase the bottom end, those low end frequencies in your tone. So just be careful with that. Remember, the tone that you're using in your bedroom and practicing in your studio or just jamming, a lot of times that's not going to be the tone that you're going to use for the recorded version, for the full mix. And it's because you probably practice and play just like I do, with more gain and more bottom end and more punch, because that sounds cool. Now let's touch on pedals real quick, okay? So the first pedal you're probably going to want to use, regardless if you're playing through a tube amp or solid state or whatever, is some type of noise gate. I use the MXR Smart Gate. It's just a standard noise gate. I bring that up because the last thing I want to happen to you is to get into your studio, you're ready to record your guitar tracks, you plug in, there's like this annoying hum, and then you look down and you're like, crap, I forgot my noise gate. Now chances are, if you're recording in your own studio, you've already got that. But if you happen to be going to another studio, you want to have these things with you. Another very common pedal that people will use in front of the amp is some type of overdrive or distortion pedal. Now, a lot of times that's used just to clean up the amp's drive. Some of these classic high gain amps, as awesome as they sound, they kind of produce a booming and somewhat muddy tone by themselves. So it's common for a lot of metal guitarists to put an overdrive pedal in front of that. Now, oftentimes you'll see on those pedals the gain or the drive or whatever is all the way down, and they'll turn the level either all the way up. I actually like the level just going to about 7. I found that to be a sweet spot for me when I'm using the pedal for this purpose. And then there's a tone knob on most of these pedals as well. A lot of times people will boost that just a little bit to give it a little bit more high end, and that helps take that boominess out as well. So that's oftentimes just to clean up the amp. Now those two pedals would go in front of your amp. So you would, connect your amp to the first pedal, which would be your noise gate, then to your overdrive, then out to your guitar. If you're using other effects like delays or maybe choruses or something like that, typically, and this is just me, I like to put those in the effects loop of the amp. Now here's the thing when recording a real live amp. It's not always a good idea to use a ton of effects, because once you record that track with those effects, you're stuck with them. What I recommend, and I don't always take my own recommendation by the way, what I typically recommend people do is record the amp as dry as you possibly can with no effects. Because remember, you can always add those effects into post-production, and I would rather people do it there because you can kind of play around with the settings using the plugins and that sort of thing. But remember, if you use, like, let's say some weird delay or like ambient reverb, you record your guitar tracks, then you get into the studio and you find out this really isn't working with the mix, you're kind of hosed. You're gonna have to go back and re-record your guitar tracks again without those effects. So that's just a little tip there. The one important thing I want to mention in this video, guys, is I'm not trying to tell you that you should use my exact settings. That's not what I'm saying. I know sometimes good settings and good metal tone can be a very subjective and sometimes personal topic. Some people get real touchy about their tones, and I understand that. The point of this video, well, the point of this whole series is to help you get a good usable tone in the full mix. And the purpose of this specific video really is just to give you a starting point, just a guide, just like a template to use. I believe if you start with the settings I gave you here though in this video, that you'll be able to dial in a usable tone much quicker. At least I hope so anyway, and that's my goal, to help you get a good metal tone in the mix. Now remember, I've got a complete video tutorial on recording and mixing metal guitars. I'll put the link up here, and I'll also put that link in the YouTube description below, which there's going to be some more links in there. In that description box, I've got a free guitar guide I give away, and you can listen to my music in there, all that good stuff. So check those out. Guys, please give this video a thumbs up. Make sure you subscribe to my channel and ding that little bell. I'll see you on the next video. Until then, keep it metal.